Hello.
Hello. How are you doing today?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you?
Oh, can't hear you. Let me fix my audio real quick.
Okay. Talking, 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 voice, talking,
Say
volume.
something now? Yeah, I hear you now. I hear you.
Good deal.
All right. Yeah, so thanks for agreeing to take some time out this morning to talk to me.
Yeah,
You know,
no
I don't even
problem.
know
I've
if
I've been there. I've been there before.
I don't even necessarily want to be doing what I'm doing, but I'm in a situation where like a bunch of the people in my immediate social circle are essentially on your side. And it's kind of been driving me crazy for several years. And it's to the point where I'm like,
To the
why are
point where you're
people
mad
getting,
about cereal boxes, right?
yeah, essentially. It's like, why are people getting mad at me because I ask a lot of questions and ascribe to more traditional beliefs about sex and gender and stuff. And the main reason that I feel the need to do this is because of how mad people get at what I consider to be really basic questions. So I feel like if people are getting this upset, then there must be something that is not being said.
Well, I can tell you why I'm upset at this particular instance right here. It's the implication that we're grooming children. I think
Mhm.
that's worthy of getting upset about.
So, when you hear grooming, I guess you're reading it as like pedophilic grooming, right?
Because that's usually what it means, yes.
Right. Yeah, I can understand why you would
And you,
interpret it that way.
and you
I'm not
also
gonna
understand that
say,
that's a very, very common trope, not just against trans people, but against gay people. So I'm a gay man. I've been accused of wanting to groom children, and I'm saying groom so it doesn't get like, we don't get in trouble. I've been accused of wanting to groom children for as long as I've been out, and that's a kind of a what I think is a reasonable sore spot.
hmm I okay, I definitely understand that. I mean, I guess maybe I may have been a little bit too charitable with James Lindsay's word choice because there is a reading of the word grooming that doesn't necessarily have to be pedophilic, but I can see how I can like it's totally understandable that that word would be a sore spot.
It's at its most charitable interpretation, it's pedophilic adjacent.
Well, there's a definition of grooming that means essentially preparing somebody to be in a certain like capacity. Like you can groom somebody to be like a professional sports player or something like that. Like it can be used in that way, but I definitely agree that the implication is more likely than not pedophilic. So I definitely can see why that word choice would be an issue.
Yeah, so you would agree that it's probably not great if if any time like an LGBT thing comes up aimed at kids, like calling it grooming, that is in the minds of the vast majority of his readers going to be read as has having pedophilic connotations.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that.
Okay,
But I
well
mean,
that's
if
good.
you, yeah, I mean, but at the same time, looking at at some of the more recent trends, like it's not unreasonable for people to, well, it is unreasonable for people to think that, but it's not as if there isn't evidence pointing in that favor. And by that, I'm referring to the minor attracted person stuff that was happening a couple weeks ago.
Well, yeah, the map stuff is well, no one in the LGBT community. I won't say no one, but it's like no one is like saying that it's okay to assault children.
Right. But the problem is they're using the same type of language and logic that not necessarily LGBT, but more so like the identity people use. I am this way and
No,
I should be accepted for the way that I am. That
I
type of
agree.
language.
I will say, and I won't say it's 100%, but I will say some of that, at least a portion of it, is a 4chan op. Like they're
Mm.
intentionally like
Hmm.
making stuff up to say like, hey, we should post this around. Like there's a picture that was shared around a lot by like the right wingers on the twitters about how like gay, trans, minor attracted persons they just made up this image like it was like this love is love is understanding or something to that effect, and they spread it around to try to
Hmm.
connect. And this is a very, very long-standing trope to try to connect LGBT issues with pedophilia. It's a long-standing
Hmm.
trope, a long-standing attack.
Hmm. Well, I know how 4chan works. It would be kind of unfair for me to say, like, present some evidence. That's something that I will have to probably research on my own. Because I know that 4chan does stuff like that. Like, they will intentionally make up something to stir the shit in the discourse. I personally haven't seen it, but that's probably because I haven't been looking for it. So that's something that I'll keep on my mind, and I'll be more vigilant, and I'll try to see if I can find examples of that to see if I can understand where you're coming from.
Okay. I'm sure. I'm sure it's not all from 4chan. I know that. There are some like creepy people. There are creepy people of all walks of life, all persuasions, all identities. Creepy people out there. Absolutely. I don't know if making the connection between a cereal box released during Pride Month and grooming is it's spurious at best and
Well,
outright malicious at worst.
my issue with the cereal box thing is the inclusion of the pronouns, because I see that as the encroachment of a belief system and that being targeted at children.
Why is so a belief system targeted at children is
No,
not a
no,
bad thing, right?
well, it's a belief system, but it's being targeted at children, and it's not a bad thing if it's something that is true, or maybe not necessarily true but useful. But my issue with it is that I don't think that it's fair to push something like gender identity, which is a very sort of nebulous concept, on a group of people who don't know anything about the world yet. Like,
Well,
we have grown adults that can't define gender or woman, but we're now trying to push these ideas on the class of people who still have yet to learn anything about the world.
based on what the research I've done, gender is one of the very, very first lenses through which kids developed to see the world. By the time they're 2 or 3, they do have a conception of man, of woman. They do have a conception of that. It's one of the first lenses they develop when they're toddlers. Even like as they're learning to speak, they know that man and woman are things. So
And how do they identify that? Is it based on physical characteristics? Is it based on behaviors, or a
it's a
combination of
combination.
both?
It's a combination of physical characteristics and a very vague. Uh, what's the word I'm looking for? Conception of there are these two categories of people that interact in certain ways. So it's a combination of both of them. It's a combination. Yeah, it's like what they see and how they see these traits manifest themselves in the world. Now, I don't know if this will change, as like if like the gender binary starts to become a little bit more muddled. I don't know if that will change. But the previous research that I've seen that's been conducted over the past couple decades, yeah, gender is one of the first lenses that kids develop to view the world in.
That's interesting. Do you think that that is biologically driven in any way, or do you think it's purely socially driven?
I don't. That's a meaningless distinction. Like us,
Really?
yeah, because everything we do is going to be biological, right? Otherwise, what's the alternative to something being biological? Spiritual, supernatural.
Uh, so when I'm talking about being biologically driven, like, being a female is a biological category, but being like a priest or a police officer is not. So even though a person can be a priest, their status of being that is not tied to their biology in any way. So when I'm asking about gender, I'm wondering if if the conception of gender that the children are coming up with is based solely on characteristics that are not being driven by like an underlying like biological process, or if it's purely from perceiving things from the outside world.
So the way I'm approaching this is all everything comes down to biology because we're biological creatures. So what I mean by everything is biological is it means that it's all coming from the brain. All psychology has roots in the brain. Genes are inert molecules. They don't do anything by themselves. They have to interact with the environment. So to say like which is it biological or is it social is asking to me it's like asking like is the length or the width more important in determining the area of a triangle or sorry the area of a rectangle. Like those two things are so interwoven that to separate them out into neat little categories is meaningless. And it's not this tiny overlap. It is they are the Venn diagram's almost a circle. So you have to, if you had a child, and we we have very limited information on this because it would obviously be incredibly unethical to do this. But if we had a child who grew up in isolation, no human contact, no, they would not have a conception of gender. They wouldn't have a conception of sexuality, let alone anything more complex than those two things. And even though those,
do you think that they would be able to eat, whether fully consciously or subconsciously, tell the difference between a man and a woman,
nope,
or a male and a female?
nope.
So
It has to
when
be
it
information.
so when it comes to sexual attraction, like, is that not something that is sort of innate? Like, we don't reason our way to being like, I'm attracted to this person. Like,
No,
that's an underlying biological process.
the getting horny is an underlying biological process. Now, to be clear, I'm basing this off of one case because obviously, like again, it's a good thing we don't have actual experiments or cases on this, but there was a case of like one kid in the 1800s who somehow miraculously was abandoned in the woods and somehow survived until he was found at like 10 years old. And his brain was just fucking ruined. And one of the most interesting things I got out of that from that case study, and again, this is one step above anecdote, but in this case study, he got erections, so he had what would be considered a sex drive. He just did not know what to do with it. He wasn't attracted to people because that's not something that, he couldn't associate this urge with other people. Like, that connection wasn't built in his brain. So on the very most basic aspect, we are biologically social creatures. Like, a child is not going to survive without input from other people until they're like well into not being a child anymore. So all of this stuff is there's nothing innate in our desires in the way that they would manifest themselves in society. So you can't say anything that would manifest itself in society is distinct from society.
Well,
And by society, I mean like any environment with other people.
I definitely would like to see that case, but I do a lot of my own reading of scientific articles about neuroscience and that type of stuff, and there seems to be a lot of evidence there that things like hormones that you're exposed to in utero have a masculizing effect or feminizing effect on the brain that tends
True.
to be permanent, and that results in behavioral changes that seem to correspond with what we associate gender with.
True. I'd also agree with that.
So
It's
I mean,
there's more than that, but that does seem to be documented in the literature. Mostly what I've seen it's in regards to like sexuality, but there's some overlap between sexuality and gender identity in terms of like what structures in the brain that they correspond to. So
yeah, so as long as we're not disagreeing on that, like, I could be open to, well, first of all, I have no problem with like men presenting as women, like like males presenting as females. Like, if a male wants to like wear a dress and wear makeup and paint their nails and stuff, that really has nothing to do with me. My issue is more so with the changing of our understanding of what these categories are, and I'm more so concerned with the non-binary stuff than I am with the trans stuff, because even if we don't know what causes transness, the current understanding of like masculine and feminine at like a neurological level supports the idea of at least a male and a female gender, but there's very little support for things outside of that. And I don't want us to get into a situation where gender is not being looked at in a objective or scientific standpoint in any way. Like, if we're going to have new genders, I think that we should do it in a scientific way, or at least as scientific as we can possibly get.
I am all for science, but in the past like year or so, I've backed off of it a little bit in terms of its social utility. So, like for example, there is no scientific or objective measurement of sexuality. We've tried, but it doesn't work. We do not have a good objective measurement for sexuality. We have to go by self-identification. Like, if someone tells you they're gay, that didn't come from a scientific test. That didn't come from a some sort of like sexuality dipstick that you put in someone's brain. The tests that they've tried to do are hilariously invalid. In valid, I mean, in a scientific sense, valid means it's measuring what you think it's measuring. So like the best they tried to do. Do you know how they try to measure sexuality?
No, I don't. How?
They attach stuff to your stuff and show you things and see what happens. You can see how that would be. There's some stuff that could go
it's
wrong
pretty
there.
bad. Yeah, that's pretty ethically strange. Yeah,
That's ethically, yeah.
but
I mean, it's,
but even when I get what you're saying about there being no objective criteria for sexuality, but even outside of that, in interpersonal relationships, we can kind of still come to what I think is this. I don't know, maybe objective isn't the word, but like I know that I'm
intersubjective
not.
is the word you're
I
looking
know
for.
that I'm not gay because I am not attracted to men, and I don't, like it just doesn't turn me on. So
Sure.
in comparing my experience to your experience, the lack of attraction serves as enough proof for me that you're not lying. But we don't really have that when it comes to gender.
We still sort of do. So if you think about what is the biological definition of sex.
Well, that's gonna be a pretty debated topic. I'm pretty sure there's a lot of people who don't think that sex is binary at this point.
So
The way,
it
yeah,
depends on how you define it and in what context you're defining it.
I prefer to define it through an evolutionary lens because I think, the way that we have defined sex, well, the way that evolutionary biologists define sex is based on how the organisms of the species reproduce.
Right.
So
So that
I
sexual
think the
dimorphism
more,
making large immobile gametes and small mobile gametes, right? Shut up. Sorry. 20 spam calls a day. All right. Sorry.
yeah, I'll probably get one. Yeah, I'll probably get one actually too.
Yeah, so most like in that context, in the terms of like reproductive biology is what I go to. Like it makes sense to have a binary categorization of sex because like you're concerned that the thing that you're creating the category for is reproduction, and in humans we need the large immobile gamete and we need the small mobile gamete in order to reproduce the species. Makes perfect sense to do it there. Wouldn't change a thing. We would not get utility out of a there's some utility out of recognizing that those are not the only two options, but in terms of like how to make a person, you need those two.
Hmm.
So that makes sense. But the thing with categories is you'll define these categories differently depending on the field you're in. So take my field. So I'm in exercise science. And we don't use that definition of sex because that doesn't give us the most utility. We don't, we don't play sports with our gametes. In this case, it's a much more useful kind of sliding scale of sex that we look at because hormones are the most important factor driving the differences between the typical sex categories, and those
Well,
are subject to change.
let me ask you, why is utility the baseline?
Well, because that's what the baseline for any categorization, right? We don't do it willy nilly. We categorize things based on the utility that they give us.
I thought that we categorize. Well, I thought that we categorize things based on that thing's a relation to the objective world.
Well, we do, but there's things in the objective world that exist that we don't really care about. So we wouldn't like. So for example, the reason we define species, we categorize things by species, is because they give us some objective utility, and the objective utility is like these things can produce, I think, fertile offspring with one another, things of that nature. And so that's why we have that category of utility. So, but we wouldn't categorize different species based on like the height of a cat, right? You wouldn't like large cat and small cat. We don't get as much utility from that, so we don't have a specific category for large cat, small cat. So,
Right, but even that
even
is
if they do
still looked at through an evolutionary lens. Like the way that we categorize species is not by visual stimuli. Like that's why we know that a black panther is actually just a jaguar with melanism. We know that it's not a different species because we can look at the genes and say, oh, these genes are actually just jaguar genes with like a specific mutation.
yeah, yeah, and in that context, like we use the category that gives us the most utility. So that's why like scientists know that a black panther is not a different type of cat all on its own. It's not like its own species, right? It's a not even a subcategory of a species. It's a type of animal with a specific trait.
I,
So
I don't think I'm seeing where the utility comes in there.
in that context,
Like, why is it more utile to, define a Black Panther as a jaguar and not its own species?
Oh, because like in how we have the utility we get from defining species is like can they produce fertile offspring with one another? I'm sure there's a little bit more to it. It's been a little bit since my biology courses, but like that's how people in that field would define that species. Like they can produce fertile offspring with other members of its species, and that's what we're really concerned about because like how animals reproduce in the wild is of a lot of importance in terms of studying the behaviors and the ecosystems that they live in.
Okay, so studying the behaviors in the ecosystems, that's where the utility comes in.
Hmm.
Okay, I get that. I get that. So in terms of so I'm trying to parse how that would relate to then sports science. Like, where does utility come in for your field?
Oh, the utility comes in. So we still use most of the research that I've read, we still use man and woman. We still use those categories when like separating out athletes because it gives us a good insight into what we're looking at. Like you wouldn't expect to see the same numbers. You wouldn't expect to see the same response to a weightlifting program in terms of absolute numbers. Still gives us a lot of utility. However, the way we define it is a little bit different because like the gametes don't matter. It's the reason these matter to my field of exercise science is because of the hormones that are typically present in men and women that would result in vastly different outcomes for a sport, vastly different like ceilings in terms of absolute strength levels, things of that nature. And so that's a more useful definition for us to have that more spectrum oriented looking at things because it's more useful in terms of their sports performance.
Yeah, but hormones aren't the only relevant difference between men and women. Like,
In
women
sport,
have
well, in sports,
wider pelvises. Women have wider pelvises, and that changes their center of gravity.
yeah, that doesn't matter.
And that doesn't matter.
Nope. It's
Does
almost a useless metric.
doesn't it change the amount of force that the frame of their body can exert compared to a man's?
Not meaningfully.
Not meaningfully. Okay, well, I'm not an exercise scientist, so I don't think I
They
can
do.
challenge you on that.
No, you are right, and they do have typically they have wider, shallower pelvises. But in terms of like biomechanics, which is what my master's degree in terms of the biomechanics, in an actual real world sports scenario, that doesn't matter all that much because a low center of gravity is not good or bad. In and of itself, it's always contextual. Like you would agree that like a lineman, they want a low center of gravity on the line, right? So a low center of gravity would be great there.
Well, so I'm getting this information from Heather Hying. This is literally something that I got from her, but her argument was essentially that the pelvis difference makes it possible is relevant in things like weightlifting because the center of gravity issue allows men to generate more force when they're lifting.
Nah, I mean, because you change your center of gravity changes depending on a lot of things. Like the second you put a weight in your hand, your center of gravity is shifted. Like if you put your arms out in front of you, your center of gravity has shifted. Like this is not a fixed set thing, and you can maneuver your body to put your center of gravity into an advantageous spot. Now the biggest, it's almost the only difference in terms of what actually matters. There's a percentage here, there's a little bit there, but the main difference is testosterone's ability to increase protein synthesis in skeletal muscle. That is the primary driver of differences between men and women. Everything else it either doesn't matter or there's so much overlap that it's not a useful category.
Okay, I'm looking at a chart that somebody sent me of some differences between men and women. Another one that I think seems pretty important is this idea that the average male's heart is larger, and because it's larger, it is more efficient at carrying blood, and that's relevant in things like endurance sports.
That is
Do you have any
relevant
thought?
in endurance sports. A larger heart is typically good, but in terms of actual VO2 capacity, VO2 is like basically how much oxygen are you burning. VO2 max is like how much energy can you burn. It's how much fuel can your engine go through is essentially what that means. And what they find is the heart is important. However, it's the skeletal muscle on top of that. The heart doesn't burn much oxygen in terms of like your sports performance. The muscles are burning the oxygen, and so you have to look at VO2. You have to look at the muscle's ability to consume oxygen. You have to look at the heart's ability to pump it. The lungs actually aren't all that important in a healthy individual, but when you normalize VO2 max in terms of fat-free mass, which is essentially normalizing it for muscle, the sex differences all but disappear. Again, it comes down to the muscles between the two sexes more than the heart. I'm not saying the heart's not important. A big, strong, compliant heart is very, very important in endurance sports, but it's as important or even slightly less important than the muscles that are actually producing the force.
Okay,
Yeah,
yeah, I get.
these differences do exist. Like, but it all comes down to what can your muscles do, and why can your muscles do them.
Okay, okay. So when it comes to sports, my conception has been that like trans women participating in women's sports can be fair only in the instance where, well, it's the most fair if you can get them on the hormones before puberty, and if you can't do that, then what is it, like 3 years before all the differences go away?
It depends on what differences you're talking about. 1 to 3 years, depending on the sport. 6 months to a year for endurance sports. 1 to 2 years for most team sports, and then 2 to 3 years for combat sports is the recommendation that I would make.
And is that it, like in your estimation, is that how this is being addressed?
Well, it depends on the organization, but yeah, most like the IOC, there's a lot of organizations. I can't remember them off the top of my head in the United States and Canada and the UK. They're looking at this stuff. There was a paper by Hilton and Lundberg that the World Rugby Organization used. I actually did a response to that on my channel. It is the if you are more interested in this, in my specific perspective, so we don't have to just go down this all the day, I have a video on my channel. It has 75 sources in it. It's this is my area of expertise.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I watched it. It's been a while. It's like sometimes I have to
It's
watch
not
things
a
more
it's
than
not an
once.
entertaining video. It's very
Yeah.
dense. If you don't
So
remember anything from it, that's trust me, you're not the only one.
right. Well, it often takes me to read or listen to something more than once before I really get it, you know.
Dude,
But
I'd have to watch it again before I realize what I was saying.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
a
yeah.
very dense video. Yeah.
But yeah, so I don't think I have enough knowledge in exercise science to really challenge you on this. All I can really say is that there's some other people who are interested in biology that are disagreeing, but I guess you'd have to debate them because I don't have
Of
the
course.
information to really challenge you on that.
Of course. I know.
My big gripe has pretty much always been with self ID and the pronouns and stuff.
Okay.
Uh, and let me to make this point clear, I want to give like an anecdote. But before I do that, like I can pretty safely assume that you're an atheist, right? And yeah, and you don't particularly like religion.
I don't hate it as much as I used to, but still not the biggest fan, no.
So when I was in high school, I went to a Catholic school, and some of our teachers were priests, and we were required to address them as father. And most everybody didn't really care, but I did have one atheist friend who really hated having to call this dude father. He hated it, and for us, we were just like, why is this such a big deal to you? Why can't you just call him by what he wants to be called? But you know, as I got older, I realized that the reason that he hated that is because he didn't share the belief system that everybody else had, and to address this person in this manner is to basically assent to that belief system. You get where
Yeah,
I'm
I
going
get
with
what you're
this?
coming from there. And I can definitely have some sympathy there. You never want to feel like you're like we're stubborn, especially Americans. We're very, very stubborn. We don't like being compelled into do anything, and I can understand that. But there's also like a basic degree of respect between people that kind of necessitates that. If you are to show respect to someone that you disagree with, there has to be some sort of acquiescence. There has to be something there. Like we have to act like I don't like religion, but I'm not gonna like. It would be incredibly insulting to someone to say like, no, I'm not gonna call you a Christian because it's a fake belief system.
Right, but there is a line though, right? There was at one point a big argument over the words "one nation under God" on the money, and that's sort of coming
Hmm.
from the same. It's coming from the same place. Like you can respect people who are who have a certain belief system, but there is a line where your beliefs need to be separate from, well, not separate, but there is a line where like respect becomes
Compulsion.
pushing, yeah, compulsion essentially.
I can agree with that to a certain extent. But there's
So
also,
like,
but again, there almost needs to be some sort of compulsion. Like if someone just really fucking hates this one group of people, I don't think it's bad for society to compel that person to tone down that hate in public scenarios.
right. So like for me, I'm willing to use a trans person's pronouns, especially if they actually, show that they're sincere. I'm willing to use it, but it's not because I believe what they believe. It's because I just don't want to be a dick, basically.
You know
but
what?
it,
Most trans
yeah,
people will say that's good enough.
yeah. But when it comes to something like neo pronouns, I am a lot less inclined to do that because, again, like you could make an argument that it's possible that a person could have a male body but an incredibly feminized brain. Like that's something that's conceivable. But the stuff that's
The
outside of,
xenogenders.
yeah, like xenogenders and that stuff, like it's so outside of the realm of the human experience that
It's literally
I,
what xenogender means, right?
yeah, like so yeah, it's so outside of it that I do not want to be compelled in any way to have to give that respect.
This is actually a debate going on in like my community right now, like whether or not xenogenders are valid. I don't give a shit about that debate. I
Mhm.
don't have. I haven't thought a lot about it. I'm leaning to sort of against them, um, but yeah, I think that's incidental.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, I personally think that people should form their beliefs around the objective world, but people have religion, so they can believe what they want to believe. But is like so like people can have their xenogenders, just don't make me have to participate in your xenogender.
It always depends on.
That's essentially how I feel about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, if we're starting to like legislate, like you have to call someone Z and Zer or Fey, Fair, all that stuff, then I think it's a better. Then I think it's a more. There's a more legitimate controversy there. But in terms of like he and she, like the reason that's he, she, and they, these are pronouns that we use for everybody all the time. So you don't have to uproot or completely reinvent your nomenclature to adopt
Hmm.
these into your vocabulary because they're already there. You use them every day. Versus something like Z and Zer and stuff like that, that would be a lot more controversial, in my opinion, especially to legislate.
Right, right. And I was originally against they, but I eventually came around. I was like, ah, it's not so bad. And we do already like the point that won me over is that we do already call people they when we're not sure,
Yeah, the
what,
singular
yeah.
they.
So yeah, it's not that bad. It's not so bad. But for me, like all non-binary people get they. Like I'm not doing the I made up this pronoun and now you have to say it or you're a bigot. I'm not doing that.
Yeah, and I think that's the vast majority of non-binary people. I
Hmm.
think probably 95% of trans people and non-binary is usually considered trans. I think 95% of them are going to be using traditional pronouns.
Hmm. So when it comes to I mean, I feel like I already know what you're gonna say here, but I guess I have to ask. When it comes to like the bathroom situation, like do do you feel that like the ultimate deciders of this issue should be females? Like whether or not like trans women can be in women's spaces, like the ultimate decider of that should be the people who are most at risk, right?
I mean, sure, which is why the trans people should be deciding it.
Okay, so we're
The,
doing we're
the
doing trans women to women. Okay.
no, well, you see, the people who are most at risk, the people most at risk are trans women.
They're at risk of what?
Are at risk of what do you think? At risk of assault.
At risk of assault.
Hmm.
And I'm not sure if I have really seen that borne out, but I feel like their risk of assault is pretty. It's, I don't know if I can say if it's on the same level as the risk that is put to women by allowing self ID to be determinant factor for who gets to go to what bathroom.
So the reasoning behind this one, there has been at least one study that came out that looked at all data, and in the United States, it's part of my documents. I can find it for you here in a second. But basically, they found that there was no empirically driven evidence that states with trans-inclusive bathroom policies saw an uptick in sexual assault compared to ones without it. Turns out
But
most
isn't it isn't
turns
it
out most
also
people just want to
true?
shit and piss.
Isn't it also true that like 80% of sexual assaults don't get reported?
That is true, but
So
it would also
when it
be,
comes to
but that wouldn't it. That's we have to assume that that's true among all cases. And so, like, in order for that to be an argument, you would have to say that, like, no, it actually secretly did go up in these places, but specifically they didn't report those, and they would have to not report them in lower numbers than other places. We would still see, even if 80% of sexual assaults go unreported, we would still see an uptick in the ones that were, if this was the constant variable.
I get what you're saying. I still kind of disagree on principle. Like sometimes we consider something to be a bad rule, even if bad things don't generally tend to happen. Like I actually just made this point in a Twitter argument where, I don't need my house to burn down to know that it's a bad idea to leave the stove on,
Of
It's
course,
like
because there's a lot of
sometimes we don't, yeah.
there's a lot of data to say that, like, leaving the stove on is a big risk factor in causing this.
Right, but I've left the stove on several times and my house never burned down.
Right.
So it's like just because something bad doesn't happen doesn't mean that it's not a bad rule. Like I think it's perfectly fine for a person to object to this purely on principle, to be honest.
I guess you can, but there's also, like, well, what happens to the trans women? Like, the other principle will be like, well, what happens to the trans women who are now forced to use one, if they're somehow forced to use the men's restroom, I think we can safely say they are far more likely to be assaulted.
I'm gonna need to see some like assaults statistics. Like,
Well, if you threw away the statistics for this argument, you got to accept this without them.
wait, say that again. If I
If you
threw
say
away the statistic,
if you say you don't need statistics to know that something's a bad idea on principle, you can't now say, well, I need statistics.
you're kind of just assuming that men are gonna beat up trans women at this point.
It does happen a lot. Like, the assault rates for trans people are far higher than they are for cis people. Like, a lot higher.
Yeah, okay. I'm gonna have to do some of my own research on that because I'm not sure if I'm not sure if I can accept that just by being told it.
Okay. Here is, by the way, here's my documents. I'm not sure if, like, the assault is here. Let's see. There's like 50 sources here. Oh, okay. Transgender teens. I just control left assault. Transgender teens with restricted bathroom access at higher risk of sexual assault.
Teens. So this is like in a school setting.
Researchers looked at
So
data
essentially
from
essentially bullying.
yeah, well, but specific sexual assault bullying, and it wouldn't have to be sexual assault for it to matter. So even if, like, a trans woman wasn't sexually assaulted in a bathroom and they were just beat up, that's still an assault. That's still something that is worth considering.
hmm Yeah, I mean, I maybe I'm just undervaluing this because I've been in fights when I was a kid, and I just consider it something that happens. But yeah,
I don't know. That's not a great way to look at things, though, right? Like, sexual assault. I mean, it's just something that happens. Like, it's not a
so
great way to look
so
at it.
you're making the argument that trans kids are being like literally raped or like getting or
Sexually
like what getting.
assaulted. I don't. I'd have to look at it, but sexual
Well, yeah,
assault is what they
sexual
use.
assault is a very broad category. It could be like somebody grabbed your tit, or it could be somebody literally raped you. So, like that word kind of it doesn't do it for me because like we've broadened the category. Well, it's not that we've broadened the category. It's just that sexual assault is a very wide category to begin with.
It is, but it doesn't have to be rape before it's bad. Like, if a trans woman sexually assaulted a cis woman in a bathroom, could I then say, well, sexual assault's a broad category, it's not rape?
Well,
I don't
I'm
think
just
that'd be
more
good,
interested
right?
in understanding because it seems to me that there are levels of severity when it comes to this. Like if I slap a girl on the ass without her consent, like that's sexual assault, but
Mm-hmm.
that's not nearly as bad as the other thing.
It is, but but the argument that you're making could be applied very equally in both directions.
In both.
Yeah.
I don't get what you're saying.
So it could be very easy, like if you're worried about cis women being sexually assaulted, why couldn't I use those exact same arguments? If you're
If
worried
I'm
about,
worried,
yeah, if you're worried about cis women being sexually assaulted by trans women in bathrooms, why could I not say, well, there's a huge range of sexual assault? Like, did the trans woman just like poke her in the boob and then leave? Well, that's not rape. That's not that bad. Like,
oh well, yeah, well
could
yeah,
easily apply in both directions.
I actually would, yeah, I actually would apply that same logic. Yes, I'm concerned about like the more severe forms of sexual assault,
Well, of course. And
like where someone is being like penetrated, essentially.
okay, what about physical assaults?
Yeah, physical assault sucks, and if I can be convinced that, you know, like a trans woman is at risk of getting beaten up anytime they go into like a male bathroom, then I could change my position on that. But like maybe I just haven't been paying enough attention to that.
So on page, I'd say in my doc on page 7, when it starts common turf talking points, so I'm coming at this in an unbiased way.
Hmm.
I have, let's see, I have quite a few resources, quite a few links to studies and surveys that point to a much higher rate of victimization, including sexual victimization of trans people.
Is it a, oh okay, yeah, it's in commentary. And of detransition being prevalent, chromosomes make them man woman claim, forcing children. In which one of these is that? Oh, maybe in suicidality.
No, no, it'd be under the number 1.
Number
I would
one.
just control F assault.
Nearly 3,700 U.S. teen aged 13 to 17. 36% of transgender or gender non-binary students with restricted bathroom or locker room access reported being sexually assaulted in the last 12 months, according to May 6, 2019.
And the actual link to the study is there. Obviously, I'm not going to repost the entire study under each link, but the link is there. And unfortunately, because you know what Sci-Hub is?
Yeah.
Unfortunately, Sci-Hub sometimes those links don't last a long time, and I have not gone back through to fix broken links. But I did put the titles of the study are the links of the study, so you can copy and paste to search for the title of the study in your browser and put that into Sci-Hub if you need access to it. I
Right,
need
right.
to go back and fix these links at some point.
So again, I find the term sexual assault to be not like it's too broad for me to use that as a baseline to determine like how bad they have it, you know? Like maybe it's just the man in me, but like I kind of expect kids to go through like a little bit of like bullying at some point in their lives, like because kids are just kind of shitty.
Kids are shitty, and sometimes it is okay to punt them. However, we'd still like to make that as low as possible, right?
Right, right. But I mean, I'm sure there's a lot more data about this, but I would be interested in the severity of the sexual assaults. You know,
Well,
if it's just somebody getting their ass grabbed or something, then it kind of sucks. But I've had my ass grabbed before by somebody who just assumed I was gay, and I didn't like lose my mind. And
I,
I could 100% say I was sexually assaulted by this gay man, but like it was so like not I didn't die, so I kind of just let it go. But maybe that's just me.
yeah, and you can also see like that would if it was like a gigantic 250-pound gay dude, and if you were like 130 pounds, how that same interaction would be a lot scarier.
Right, right, right. Like if he had backed me into a corner and then started, yeah, that's a different scenario
No, no,
than like just
even if it was the
yeah.
exact same scenario, but you were of two vastly different sizes. I get
Oh,
like women who say that they are afraid of being assaulted. Absolutely, I get it. Right, I'm a relatively small dude, and even I like if I'm like I'm like 5'8", 200 pounds. It's not tiny, but it's short. And if there's like a 6'5", 300-pound dude, like I want to be afraid of him. Like, yeah, it can be kind of scary, and most women are smaller than most men, so I get where that fear comes from. However,
Right.
there's also like the fear of any sort of gender nonconformity. And when I say gender nonconformity, I'm including that entire umbrella. If you're trans, if you just dress a certain way but you're completely cis and straight, if you are visibly and openly like gay, like your risk of assault is a lot higher because like we still have. It's getting a lot better, but there's still that like anger of going against the norm in society that causes a lot of people to get physically angry.
Right, right. And I do think that we have work to do in that area. And I guess I would kind of prefer us to do more work in getting like men in general to just be less of an asshole towards people who, are gender nonconforming.
What do you think of the idea of if we flatten the gender differences, if we flatten the significance of gender differences from an early age, if we flatten those, do you think like men will start to see women more as people and less as like objects of romantic or sexual interest? How they might just
Well,
be other people.
I think that a lot of men's behavior towards women is sort of biologically driven. So I
My
don't
argument
expect
against
that to go away
well, my
entirely,
well,
but
my
I do
argument
think
against.
that, yeah,
Sorry, I'm sorry. Finish your point.
I don't expect that to go away entirely, but I do think that we can socialize a lot of that out of kids.
Yeah, a big argument I would put is like gay people. Like most of my friends are dudes. So like because of a different circumstance where like my romantic and sexual partners are my same gender, I can view that entire gender through a different lens. Like they're not just sexual partners; they're their own people, and I can like divvy it out. Like wait, which of these are not potential romantic interests, and which of them are? And then I can also view the entire woman gender as like their own people because they're since I'm not interested in them sexually or romantically, I could just view them as people. And I would have what I would consider now it's still raised in a society, a much more egalitarian view of gender and gender relations than a lot of people. Not based on any sort of like virtue that is within my heart, but based on the circumstances that I grew up with.
So you mentioned flattening the gender differences between kids. What would that actually look like?
I think less separation between them. Like do away with the pink aisle in a Walmart. I know that sounds like something so small, but you gotta
No,
remember.
no, that not
Yeah,
no, that's fine.
yeah, like toys. It seems like so small, but you got to remember like how much like toys play a role in kids' lives. Actually, I don't know if that's true anymore. Did like physical toys, are they still a big thing with kids?
I don't know. I don't
Or
have
they're on their iPads on with their
Yeah, there are.
MySpaces.
Yeah.
Uh, and we
I
already see
think
this.
probably at like the youngest ages they may do it, but yeah, there comes an age where they get an iPad and then it's all downhill from
I
there.
think we see a lot of this in Gen Z. Like they do have a lot more egalitarian like gender relations, and we do see a lot more of them being gender nonconforming. So like I think it's a good thing. It maybe as horrible as like online interactions are, the fact that like everyone can be shitty to each other equally, maybe that'd be a good thing.
Yeah. When it comes to whether or not we can change the way that men like associate with women and gender non-conforming people, I think that male puberty is always going to be a major roadblock. Like just the teenage horniness
Teenage
and
horniness.
the pressure from other people to have sex, I think, is what drives a lot of these attitudes, because we do a lot of lip service saying like, oh, we need to make men less toxic and see women as people, but at every single turn, these same people will turn around and make fun of a man for not having sex. Like
This is true.
if you want to actually make this better, then that's something that we have to just stop doing entirely.
Actually, you know what? I would agree with that. I engage in that behavior a lot. And like one of my favorite insults is this man does not fuck. And I can absolutely see that there's some toxicity there. I am reinforcing some stereotypes. Reinforce not even stereotypes, reinforcing harmful behaviors.
Yeah, and
Uh,
it directly causes people to be like, well, no, I don't want to be seen as lame because I'm not having sex. Well, I got to go fuck somebody, And like, I think that attitude of like saying men, if you don't have sex, you are like less than other people.
Hey,
That
for what it's worth,
attitude,
yeah, for what
yeah,
it's worth, I 100% agree with you, and I have engaged in that behavior not recently, like I engaged in that behavior yesterday. So yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. That is something that I personally need to work on.
Right, right. So yeah, like, and I think that by itself would go a very long way in changing the attitude, like the general attitude that a lot of men have,
Yeah,
and that's something that's a big problem in the culture,
you know what?
and
Yeah,
personally
100% agree.
triggers me a lot.
100% agree. Absolutely.
hmm
Uh, there's also, what do you think about like sex education in schools?
So obviously, children do have to have sex education. Uh,
By the way, if you've never
yeah.
been in this conversation before, be real careful with saying children.
Okay. Well,
I'm
yeah. Like teenagers, like once you get to puberty, you need to have this information. That's how I feel.
yeah. I'm
So
just
that you
saying like
can, yeah.
you're correct. But bad faith actors will say like what you want like 6-year-olds to
Right.
learn
Yeah.
about
They'll
like
they'll
butt
they'll
fucking.
select that one word and then
Yeah.
just go down a whole train of bullshit. I see what you're saying. But yeah,
Uh,
no, I think once kids get around puberty age is when you need to start, telling them this stuff.
yeah. And a big obstacle to that is like the current kind of things that James Lindsay are pushing. If we do have sex education books, if we have books about sex that are aimed at teenagers, everyone agrees that they need that. Abstinence only education doesn't work. The kids, like, well, even I'm doing it. Teenagers, especially like going through puberty and just after puberty and in high school and stuff, they are, if they're not interested in sex, well, when they're very interested in sex, if not having sex. Like,
hmm
yeah, people, kids, fuck, I keep doing it. I'm 31. Everybody under the age of 20 is a kid to me. Um, high school, they're having sex. And if they're not being taught about it, like, they're not, one, they might develop some pretty bad sexual habits, pretty bad sexual relations, pretty bad views around sex, engage in risky sexual practices. There's a lot of negative outcomes, and we do need to teach high schoolers about sex. However, I think a big push that James Lindsay is like really gearing towards now is like, no, all that stuff is grooming.
Yeah. To be honest, I think the whole conversation about like children being exposed to sex in schools is kind of irrelevant because when you think about how much access children have to the internet, there's like no way that they aren't being exposed to much worse shit than what James Lindsay is talking about. So like that's why I'm not that whole topic doesn't really like I don't really think about it that much because I see it as a futile effort anyway. Like any kid that can get on the internet is gonna be exposed to sexual stuff and they're gonna find out.
Dude,
Like
when I
there's
was,
nothing we can do about
yeah,
it.
dude, I remember looking up naughty pictures on fucking dial-up internet. Like you had to wait for that shit. Like it was like
Yeah.
it was 5 minutes waiting for a picture to download. The entire time, like you're looking over your shoulder. And even before that, like dirty magazines, that was a trope in '80s movies.
Yeah,
Like,
yes, exactly.
yeah, like kids would
And
find.
it in many ways we can't like you don't even have to look it like it you don't have to look for it. It'll find you. Like I'm constantly mad at YouTube for like trying to show me this like streamer with the big titties. I'm like, where is this coming from? Like I never asked to see this, but I will click on it.
If I had a conservative like bent here, like I do think that there needs to be more responsible platforming. I want like the porn industry. I want them to be considered as more legitimate. That way, they can be subject to more regulations and higher standards, which includes like what content they produce. Like there's still a lot of like very illegal shit on porn sites,
Oh yeah, yeah.
as well as like because if they're not seen as legitimate, they won't act legitimate. So like making better, more barriers that would make it harder for kids to go to like hardcore porn sites, I think is a good thing. I do think the average age being like 11 that you're exposed to like pornography, I don't. I think that's iffy. There's enough research out there to say like that could be harmful to a lot of kids in the same way like being exposed to like a lot of violence would be harmful. Like to me, I don't know why we treat those things as incredibly different. Like I don't think a kid seeing hardcore pornography or very explicit violence is a good thing at a young age, especially if there's no like educational context behind it. If they're just finding it out in the wild, I think that's bad. But at some point, we do need to have a healthy sex education. But because sex education is still, we still have this like semi-puritanical view of sex in the United States. Anytime that's brought up, it's considered like, oh, you want to like have a sex scene in a book aimed at high schoolers? Oh, that's grooming. instead of like, well, no, like maybe like that's good information. Would you rather them look at it there in context, done responsibly by someone whose aim is to have a healthy sex scene that high schoolers can like learn from, or do you want them to see like a Backdoor Sluts 9 on Pornhub?
Right. Yeah, yeah. Like reflexively, I like my intuition is to say like no, showing kids sex is bad, but I mean by kids I mean like teenagers.
It's hard not to do that, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Fucking
yeah. Yeah, it is hard not to do that. But it's like if I try to form an argument for why, none of the arguments really make that much sense because it's like one, they're gonna find out anyway. The only argument I can see is that maybe it causes them to form an unhealthy view of sexual interactions, but then you get into a discussion of well, what do you define as unhealthy? Like the only thing that I feel like you can really say is clearly unhealthy is like non-consensual sex, but like anything else, like how do you say that that's an
I
unhealthy
would say
view of
like
sex?
non-consensual. That's harmful. Unhealthy
Yeah.
would be like I think, probably objectification of other people. That I think that's considered that could be unhealthy. Risky sexual practices without proper like care. I think that's unhealthy. Stuff like
So
that.
is objectification like simply finding somebody sexually, like is it lusting after somebody?
No,
Is that objectification?
no. Objectification is literally like dehumanizing them. They are an object to stick your dick in. And it's like nothing matters beyond that. I think that's what I mean by objectification. I think my husband's incredibly hot, but I don't objectify him. So, like, yeah, there's a
Right.
difference between lust and objectification, and the objectification is like when you're dehumanizing another person, literally reverting them to an object where their only purpose to you is sex.
Right. I guess I'm just
And porn can
not
do that.
sure. Yeah, porn definitely can do that. I guess I'm just not sure how much like actual objectification actually occurs. Because it's hard to really be in somebody else's mind and know like they see you only as a sex object.
Oh yeah,
Like, yeah.
in this context, so let's say we had two identical sex scenes, explicit sex scenes. You see everything. One of them is in a movie with characterization. You know who these two people are. You know their relationship. You're going to, and most importantly, you're going to see them after this. Versus a porn scene in which you're just
Hmm.
seeing the sex. You don't know who these people are. You have literally the purpose that you are engaging with these two people is to see them mash into each other, and that's all they are to you. And while that's not bad in and of itself, if that's your primary lens to view sexuality, if that's where you see sexuality, explicit sexuality, if that's the only place you see it, that can, in some people, instill an unhealthy relationship with sex.
Right, right. I agree with that. I agree with that. I think we may disagree on how prevalent that is because in my experience, like that's just not how it goes in the real world. Like you can't go up to a girl and be like, "Hey, let's fuck," or maybe I'm just not attractive enough to do that. But it's never worked for me.
Oh no, I'm not saying it's going to be like everybody. But it's enough people like there are like people who are more prone to that I think can feed into bad behaviors. Like I don't think video games make people violent. I think
No,
violent video,
yeah,
but I
that's one of the
think
stupidest things I've ever heard
but
in
I
my
think
life.
violent video games can make violent people more violent. Does that make sense?
Right, right, right. Yeah, I can see that being the case. It can exacerbate an already bad circumstance.
Right. You're not gonna take a sweet little Timmy and turn him into a mass murderer by letting him play Halo.
Yeah, like if that were the case, GTA would have caused so many murderers already. Like the fact that GTA hasn't by itself increased the level of psychopathy in the world, like pretty much proves that video games don't really have that much of effect on violent behavior.
Yeah. However, if you do see someone who is like exhibiting behaviors in GTA, they're taking pleasure in killing innocent people. That could be a red flag,
Hmm.
depending on how they're doing it. So
Well, I'm not gonna lie, I do that in GTA, but that's because I think GTA is like a I don't like GTA. I don't like it. So whenever I get into it, like I will do the stupidest shit imaginable just because I want people to see how absurd this game is.
yeah. Well, again, there's different ways, and it always comes down to like some sort of like qualitative analysis of their behaviors. That seems overly
Hmm.
clinical, but if you're talking about mass murderers, like clinical's good.
Hmm. We've kind of gotten off track. So it seems like we're agreeing on a lot of stuff, like I think we both share the end goal of trying to allow for a greater range of expression for people to have.
Hmm.
It's just I want to do that without changing words around. Like
Um,
I think we can achieve the same goal without having to change the definition of woman and sex and gender and all that stuff.
well, because language is so important, it's like sometimes you got to change words. Like we had to change what marriage meant in order to for me to be married, for like it to increase like gay acceptance in society. So we kind of had to change the definition of what marriage was.
Yeah.
It had to be done. There's a
On that
certain
specific yeah.
go on.
On that specific issue, when I was first learning about it, I was like, well, why does it matter if you're married or not? You can just live together. But what eventually changed my mind was when I realized that there are legal benefits that you get from having the status of marriage. And that's when it became an issue of like, oh, okay, well, these people should get the same legal benefits. So, I can accept this change.
Well, of course, there's the legal benefits, but there's also a social benefits. And that, to me, I was much more concerned with the social benefits of being married. Like, because my the relationship with my husband is very important to me, and there's a very big difference that most people will hear in your mind say, "Hey, this is my girlfriend," versus "Hey, this is my wife." Those have pretty different connotations in
Hmm.
someone's mind. And if your relationship is important to your life, which that's for most people it would be, making that like this is my partner, this is like someone who I'm spending my life with, versus this is someone who I see on the weekends and we rub our naughty bits together sometimes, and that's all they are to me.
Right, but you don't necessarily have to go through the whole ceremony to say this is my husband.
Right? You don't have to. You don't have
Yeah.
to do that, but it's to say that and to have some like legal weight behind it it feels good. It's important socially. I like legal ramifications are important, but social ramifications to me are just as important. Because I don't interact with the legal system very often, but I do interact with people. Not as often as I'd like, but I do interact with other people, and so that's going to be a lot more salient in my life, even if the individual instances aren't as important as an individual legal instance.
Hmm. I'm not sure if I agree with the social benefits part. I may have to just ruminate on it a little bit, but for me, when it comes to the marriage thing, it was specifically learning that you literally get tax breaks if you're married, and that's huge.
Yeah, and you
That's
and you
that's
don't have
pretty
to,
big.
and you can have a different conception of like why it's important or not important to get married, and what that means to you. That's fine. I can understand that, but I also think it's pretty reasonable for me to like say that hey, I have a different conception of it that I think makes intuitive sense. To someone, and that's what I'm concerned about is the social ramifications. And I think there's a direct parallel here between trans people. The legal benefits are incredibly important, but so are the social benefits. Like it sucks. Like if someone is like constantly invalidating your identity, even if it's not like illegal, it can still fucking suck, and that can still be a bigger part of your life than a legal case would be.
Right. Well, I have two things to say about that. The first, like in terms of the social benefits, like how does your life change having the status of marriage as opposed to not having it? Like I assume that your love for your husband is just as much as it was before that. So
Hmm.
I'm kind of stuck on what actually changes.
It makes it more concrete. So what if I introduce, like, especially to like my family, if I to say that this is my boyfriend means you can change, you can stop this, just dump him. You don't like you could just like snap your fingers and be done with it. If I say this is my husband, ooh, we're a lot more entangled now. We're a lot
Right, right.
closer together. I can't just dump him. Like this is an important person in my life. We're gonna share stuff. We're sharing now. We're sharing finances. And, now we're sharing equity in a house. Now we're sharing resources. A lot more intertwined in the legal system. And I've made that jump because it's so important to me.
Yeah, but that's referring again to the legal benefits. Like without that, like you could still say this is my husband, and I don't necessarily see what changes. But like when you bring in the legal part, yes, I 100% agree.
Well, yeah, but the legal parts in part other social things onto it, too, right? Like if you were legally a thing that in like by extension, that is going to have a social meaning. That legal concept is going to have a social meaning behind it that adds greater weight to it because we do put some weight on the legal system.
I'm not sure that any person like interacting with you would like see a difference between you being legally married and you being just saying like we're married because we have agreed to do so.
Because marriage does have a meaning that has an intersubjective meaning to it. So if you say that if you say, hey, here's my wife, but you're not actually married, I think a lot of people would take like, wait a second, you're not married.
Yeah, but how would they know? Like
Oh,
how
well,
would they know
again,
that you're not
they
actually married?
they wouldn't unless you told them. If they found out, I mean, I'd feel a little bit weirded out. Like, wait a second, like if you're not married, why are you calling yourself married? So there's because there is that certain like legal context to it. And I do think that's why it's important, not to like instill that in the legal system, to instill protections for trans people.
Right. And for me, I feel like the legal aspect of it is the only part that makes it different from just having a boyfriend or having just a person that you like spend a lot of time with. The only thing that makes that meaningfully different to me is the legal benefits
How
and
about
protections that come
okay?
with it.
Well, and that's how you think. That's fine. But there's also, I think it's a reasonable implication to say that there's a connotation to marriage in society that goes beyond the legal. Like if we go all of our like fairy tales, all of the media that we consumed growing up as kids, the two people got married at the end, and kids don't know shit about the legal process. They don't know shit about what tax breaks you're gonna get when two people get married, but they do know that being married means that you love each other.
Right, right, right.
Love each other for be happily ever after. So that connotation is instilled very early on, even beyond. And then when you get older, you learn the legal benefits. But there's still that thing in the back of your head. No, marriage is between two people who love each other.
Right, right. And so we may have to just agree to disagree there. It's not really that big of a deal,
Yeah, but
but
it's to set up like you might not necessarily agree with that, and that's fine. But it's to understand why other people would have a different perspective. That's where the agreeing to disagree should come from.
and I'm all for allowing people to have other perspectives. It goes back to like there's a line where respecting other people's thing can sometimes become coercive. So that's what my main focus is. So as it relates to like trans people and stuff,
Yeah,
the
there is a level of coercion.
yeah.
Like if someone cannot say that I'm not married, and I fucking love if making bigots say like, nope, I'm married. Legal system says it. I got the certificate. Means I'm married. Shut the fuck up. So
Hmm.
I take great pleasure in compelling people to do that. Um, but so there is a level of compulsion that kind of has to happen. That's why the legal system is there to make people get along. And if people don't want to get along, you kind of have to compel them to. It's the level of burden it places on compelling, though. So, like, if you just can't call someone a certain pronoun, I don't see that as a big implication on the way that you work, what your life is going to be. It's not causing any great harm to you, and if it is, that seems like it's so subjective and to you that we can't enforce it as a rule in society.
Right, right. So the pronoun thing is less severe than some of the other things that people are upset about, namely like the women's changing rooms and the sports thing. So when it comes to in coercing rules in that department, that's where I think it becomes important that everything that we're talking about is based in something like objective.
Yeah, and again, that's where my stats come in. I'm gonna we're tabling the sports stuff, but in
Yeah.
terms of changing rooms and in terms of like those single sex spaces, those women only spaces, there's I think the evidence is pointing to like it is beneficial as a whole for society to include trans people into those spaces. It's we reduce harm, uh, and if we don't do that, we increase harm. Like so, we're reducing harm from one level to a lower level if we make trans inclusive policies for changing rooms for rape crisis centers. I know that's a really that's a big one. The rape crisis centers. I can see. I think that's a lot more valid to have concerns with, but at the same time, like you gotta serve everybody. Like so, here's an example. If a black woman was assaulted by a white man. She was raped by a white man, and she went to a rape crisis center, and she has a fear of white people, and she goes into the rape crisis center and she sees a lot of white women working around her, and she's like, I don't fucking no, I was just raped by a white person. I don't like seeing these white people around here. I can definitely empathize with that. However, that's not, we can't make I would say it would be bad to make a black only rape crisis
No,
center.
I agree. Like, I agree that sometimes situations suck, but I don't think that there's always going to be a solution to everything that sucks, you know? And I think that it's kind of, I don't want to throw out the, I don't want to throw out the narcissist word yet, but it's kind of, there's got to be a better word.
I know
It's
what
kind of
you're self-interested.
asking too much to make everything change so that it's more convenient for you, right? Like I'm red green colorblind, and when I'm driving, like the yellow light and the red light, I like cannot tell them apart. If I don't see that light go from green to yellow, I have no idea what color that is. It could be either one, and most of the time I just stop. And I could be like, hey, we should change one of these lights to blue so that I can see it. But in my mind, that would be me imposing an unreasonable standard on the rest of society. And to me, I'm willing to just take the L and just be inconvenienced.
Um, I can sort of see that, but you also know that we have like wheelchair ramps that are legally required by like most businesses with street access, right?
Right.
We legally require that, even though it's an inconvenience to have to build an extra part of your property to build a wheelchair accessible means of accessing your building, it is inconvenient. However, we all recognize, or we have agreed upon in society, that the inconvenience is outweighed by the benefits of treating it like. You can't just go the numerical majority gets to say. If you're a numerical minority, you don't get a say. I feel like that's the notion of freedom dictates that you got to listen to the minority group of people.
Right. But when it comes to wheelchairs, like that issue is something that is crucial to their ability to function in the world. Like I'm not sure if I would compare the two things because like trans people can still function in the world if they don't get to go to the bathroom that they want.
They function significantly worse, though. All the research point to they function significantly worse.
So,
Uh,
so essentially, what you're saying is that the threat of them getting assaulted is so bad that we have to change.
the threat of them getting assaulted is so bad that we ought to change. The psychological damage that they suffer, the mental hardships that they would endure if they were constantly being misgendered, constantly being like verbally assaulted, is so great, and it so far outweighs the inconvenience of other people. That's I think it's a very very easy recommendation to say that we ought to accommodate trans people. It
Okay,
is a
well,
it is a it is a it is the right thing to do. In the same way that like I don't think you should be able to scream racial slurs in the workplace. Yeah, you're inconveniencing someone, you're limiting someone else's freedom, but that freedom is we put that like on. That's not an important freedom that you have, and it's far outweighed by the hardships you would be causing other people. So easy win. You're not doing that.
okay, I'm gonna have to do some more research on how often trans people are getting assaulted. What I'm seeing in your document seems to only pertain to teenagers. I'm interested in how common it is for like actual adults, like people of all age ranges.
Right under
But
the teenager one, right underneath it is a unequal treatment of trans people in domestic violence and rape crisis program. There are data in that study that points to much higher rates. So like trans and gender nonconforming people are twice as likely to have experienced non-consensual sexual contact than cis women. Than cis women. Let me
really,
correct my typo there. Mm-hmm.
okay, yeah, that's something that there's so much regarding like the sexual contact thing, especially with the underreported nature of it, that I have trouble accepting some of this stuff on face value.
So,
Like
on an
if
intuitive face value, if you marginalized people in society are more likely to engage in risky behaviors themselves, and more of society are going to feel freer engaging in worse behaviors against marginalized people because they're marginalized.
could you repeat that?
So, marginalized people themselves are more likely to engage in risky behaviors because of their
I
marginalized
see. Okay.
status, because they don't see themselves as part of the normal status quo, so they're not going to feel that the rules of the status quo are going to apply as much to them, or they're not going to feel like they have access to the status quo, and so they're free to like go around it or do things that are considered risky or bad otherwise. And on the flip side of that, people are more likely to feel comfortable engaging in bad behaviors against a marginalized person because the rules don't apply to them. Like, yeah,
So
I would
see, it's the second part I'm not so sure about. Well, I mean, and that could just be a me thing, but I think that that's something that we could probably socialize out of people.
sure from a young age, right?
Yeah, from a young age, yes. And but because like it's not like there's a whole bunch of like lynch mobs and that type of stuff anymore, right? Because so
Which good, but it doesn't have to get to that level before we should be concerned with it.
yeah, yeah. So like I'm not necessarily sure if I agree that this idea that like people are going to act negatively towards marginalized community is something that is just like a general rule.
Well, it's a general proclivity. Obviously, it's not going to apply to everybody. It might not even apply to most people, but it applies to enough
It
people.
applies to enough. Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, I agree. But I mean, we're never going to reach zero assholes in the world.
No, of course not. Doesn't mean we can't try.
Right. So should all of our social efforts be aimed at like reducing the amount of assholes in the world?
I think
Like,
that's a general good thing. I think it's hard for
should we?
me to pin down like what my actual like moral axiom is, but I think increasing the freedom that people can live their lives within is my ultimate goal, and that requires positive freedoms as well. It's not just what can't you do; it's what can you do. And so trying to find a balancing act between those two is very, very difficult, but it's still something, it's a good goal to strive towards. Taking away someone's ability to scream racial slurs in public is restricting their freedoms, but I think we get a much greater increase in positive freedoms from the people who would be subject to those slurs if they don't have to hear them all the time.
And so does that goal justify like changing definitions and stuff? Is that is achieving like a greater state of social harmony more important than having like a solid understanding of like the objective world?
Well, yeah, well, those two things don't have to like be in conflict with one another. Like we've already changed the definition. Like we changed the definition of man and woman to be about biological sex. Like the words man and woman existed prior to the notion of chromosomes, prior to the discovery of gametes. So to say that like sex refers to chromosomes or gametes, that is a changing of the definition from what it used to be. In the 1700s, 1600s, 1500s, we had man and woman. We didn't understand gametes. We didn't understand chromosomes. We already changed the definition of man and woman to fit those new biological definitions. We can certainly change them again, and I think in the way that most people use those words, they're not referring to chromosomes. They're not referring to gametes. They might be referring to genitalia, but they're probably referring to this social conception of gender.
But in that instance, our definition or our understanding of man and woman was born about from a lack of knowledge, which we're always going to lack knowledge.
Hmm.
But my idea is that when we change definitions, we change it to be more in line with, well, to be essentially more accurate. Like when we discover something that uproots our previous understanding, that's when it's okay to change the definition. But even though in the past we still had a conception of man and woman, just because we learn new things doesn't mean that our original conception was wrong. It's just that we got more information about the phenomenon that we were observing. Like we observed that females have wombs and give birth to children, and that males, I guess nut or whatever. Like we may
That's
not
all we
have
do.
had all of, yeah. That's all we do. We may not have had all of the science in order, but we still observed the categories.
And that's why things are changing now as well. Like, because we have a deeper understanding of gender. We know that gender is separate from sex. It's a psychological phenomenon that is socially influenced. So we have a better understanding of what that means. We have enough research in neurobiology to say that, like, there's a gender conception of the brain. That helps us relate to other people, because yeah, there, to a certain degree, because sex is awesome and making babies is important for a species. There has to be not only like what you got physically below the neck, but there's also has to be a conception of your own gender in your head, and it's incredibly complicated and it's very, very socially influenced. But there's something there, and what we see with trans people is they're figuring out what they have in their brain, how that relates to the social environment, how that relates to other people. And to say that they identify as women is a true statement. It's not saying that, like, that's not a false statement. They're not saying that they have body parts that they don't have. They're not saying that they have physical manifestations of their, body parts and body that they don't have. What they're referring to is a conception of their own gender identity, which is true. It's true in the terms of like their own self-understanding. And I think it doesn't clash very hard with our current conceptions of gender in society, because most people don't, in casual like social conversations, we don't refer to like men and women. They're identifying categories more so than they are like references to biological reproduction.
Um, okay, so you said a lot there. I'm glad that you mentioned the part about gender being in the brain. I do want to talk about that, man. You said a lot there. There's a lot of things I want to touch on,
I said like
but
50 things. I know. I'm sorry.
yeah. So let's start with the gender being in the brain thing. So like a lot of people that I argue it will go pure social constructionist. Like like it's not something that is biological at all, et cetera, et cetera. But so are you saying that you're saying that you have evidence that gender is like how we have a language center in the brain?
Uh-huh.
Do you think that we have like a gender part or like a couple parts that make that up?
With
Because
with two caveats. One, as long as we're not saying that like gender is like this one section in the brain. It's like colloquially, there are parts of the brain that can merge together to form a conception of gender. And two, remember my caveats from earlier, that everything we do is rooted in biology because we are biological. And so if someone is doing a thing, if someone thinks or does a thing, it's rooted somehow in biology. And to have this, and so when we look across cultures, we do see conceptions of gender, and not only binary conceptions of gender. Like there's two spirit people, we have third genders in other cultures. So there's
right,
something
but
there. And if we see this
not
common phenomenon that is shared across people, if we see that it's shared across enough people within the human population, we can probably say that no, this is referring to something that can be shared in some aspect across the human brain.
okay. Well, everything that we do is based in our biology, but not all of the concepts that we have about the world or about our own selves are always true. Like using this logic, you could say that, well, people believe in God, therefore God must exist. Well, no, it's just,
You would
our
say
reason is
that
fallible.
the belief in God is biological.
Yeah, the
It's the
belief in
feeling
God is
counts.
about, yeah, right.
Yeah.
So you could say that the belief in the gender identity is biological, but the gender identity is not necessarily true. Well, that's what's up for question.
What's up for questioning. Like again, if a trans person is saying that they have body parts that they don't have, they are incorrect. But they don't do that. That's not how trans people relate to their gender identity. It's something. This is a self-conceptualization they have that makes the most sense for them to interact with the world.
Like I have no problem with saying that, this person behaves and interacts with the world in a way that is more consistent with stereotypically female traits. Like that's fine to me. But I'm not sure if I believe in the concept of gender identity. Like I have never, I don't have this thing going on in the background where I'm just like I'm a man all the time. Like for me, being a man is like I have a penis and that's all it is to me. So
Well, it's hard for people with like normative identities because we develop identities through differentiation. So, for example, the word heterosexual was coined not long after, but years after the term homosexual. There wasn't a term for heterosexuality, nevertheless straight. There wasn't a term for that before there was for homosexuality because there was no reason to differentiate this particular identity. So straight people, cis people, white people to a certain extent,
Hmm.
often don't have a conceptualization of that identity because it's seen as the status quo. It's seen as normative, and therefore they don't need a reason to differentiate their identity from the norm. So people do have what would be considered gender identity. If you have a conception of yourself as a man or a woman and you're cis, well, you still have that gender identity, but because it's not differentiated from the norm, might not be cognizant of that gender identity, or it might not have much meaning to you.
Right. I've heard this line of argument before, and I'm sort of not convinced by it because it just allows it's basically saying, well, you don't experience what I experience, so you just don't get it. And that might be true, but it's not really convincing.
I can see why it wouldn't be convincing. Um,
Because like you could use that for anything. It's like, well, you don't know that I'm not like a magical serpent because you don't know what I'm going through. Like,
well, again, we go back to like sexuality. Like you don't know that I'm gay, but there's a certain like you've seen enough of it in the world to say like, oh,
you
this is
know,
a thing that exists, and
yeah.
the best I got is to trust what you say.
Well, I don't know that you're gay, but I know that I'm not gay because I am not attracted to men.
Yeah, in the same
And
way you can
if
know that
yeah,
you know that you're a man. You feel comfortable identifying with the word man, and so you can say like, I know that I have this, and I know that if I felt more comfortable, and you can conceptualize what it would be like to feel more comfortable identifying as a woman. So you can still like make sense of it through that differentiation.
but see, I guess that's where the problem comes in, is because my identification with manhood has nothing to do with characteristics that I have. It just has to do with my anatomy. And there's a difference in how the conception of manhood and womanhood is perceived, not perceived, but conceived by both parties involved. Like you have a population of people to whom this word only references their sex, the fact of their sex organs, and then you have another group of people for which this word is about certain qualities like attitudes and the clothes that you wear or
Would
I,
you
like to be honest,
feel
I don't know how they come up with it, but yeah.
would you feel discomfort if against your will you were being fed estrogen? Like, well, ignore the violation of consent. If all of a sudden you woke up one day and your levels had switched, and now you have a hormone profile, an endocrine profile that was of a typical woman,
Mhm.
and uh, and the new dress code at your place of work now said now you have to wear a dress and you have to grow your hair out long, would you experience discomfort from those physical changes to your body and the way society is expecting you to interact? Would you feel a sense of discomfort there?
Well, for one, if that were to happen, I don't think there's any way that I would know that that is what happening. I would probably just be like, man, I feel different all of a sudden.
I mean, it would
And
take a while, but eventually you'd start developing some secondary sex characteristics.
right, right. And I can't say for sure how I would feel about that.
I can say pretty definitively, I would feel enormously uncomfortable. I would hate that. I would hate developing breasts. I would hate that my beard wouldn't be as full. I like being a man. I feel very comfortable in that identity. I like being referred to as a man. I feel comfortable with it. And if that flipped, I would feel a very, very large sense of what would be exactly called gender dysphoria. I'm being treated and I feel like something that I really, really, really do not identify with.
Hmm. Yeah, see, yeah, I'm just not sure if I can say that. Like, I feel like the only discomfort I would feel would come from having the secondary sex characteristics, but still having a penis. Because I'm just like, well, you know, people are gonna look at me. The discomfort I feel would be solely because of other people's perceptions,
Yeah, but other
knowing
people's
that I have these secondary characteristics, but not like the actual sex.
yeah, and how other people view you can have start to have like intrinsic and internal effects on you, right? Like how
Hmm.
other people, how we perceive other people to perceive us, is itself an internal characteristic.
How other people perceive us. Yeah, yeah, I guess that does make some sense. But that doesn't do much for like the gender dysphoria because presumably you have gender dysphoria regardless of how people perceive you.
Um, it's hard to say because again, nobody lives on an island. Everybody interacts with other people. It's hard to say definitively. Like a big argument, not argument, a discussion in the trans community is that if we lived in a gender abolished society, we did not have the concept of gender. Would you have gender dysphoria? And a lot of people say like no, because I wouldn't have any sort of like expectation or conception that would conflict with my own like self actualization. That's a big discussion in the trans community, but that's juxtaposed with well, that's a we do live in a society with gender. We do live in a society with roles, expectations, pronoun usage, and what have you. We do live in that society, and that's where the dysphoria comes from. So that's what we need to engage with.
Right. And I guess I have trouble distinguishing that type of dysphoria from other types of dysphoria. Like there's a lot of people who are unhappy with their bodies, but they're not all trans.
Well, of
Like
course.
yeah, when I was younger, I, for a long time, was just very uncomfortable being black. Like I just didn't like it. And like eventually I reasoned my way out of that. I was just like, this is stupid. Like there's nothing you can do about it and it's immaterial. And in my mind, I would like for other people to be able to do that. I don't see why that's not an option.
It is an option. Like you can certainly like it's all for the individual. Like if you experience gender dysphoria, it's up to the person. Like how do they want to deal with it? And what most of the research point to is like identifying and living as your gender identity has a lot more palliative effects than not. Well,
Hmm.
well, again, it always depends, like based on how severe the gender dysphoria is and like where it's coming from. But generally speaking, like an affirmative approach to trans healthcare is it's the way to go. It's what's gone with by all medical organizations because it's what's is the most effective.
Hmm. See, I'm sort of like stuck on the whole idea that if there were no society, there would be no gender dysphoria, because that makes it sound like this is not a psychiatric condition, but more of like a malaise with the society that you live in.
Well, that's all of mental health research. All mental health, all psychiatric conditions, all psychological conditions, all
Uh,
of them are rooted in society.
is schizophrenia rooted in society?
In terms of its medicalization, yes.
But it's like it's a real mental state though.
Yes.
Like it's yeah.
Again, don't differentiate those. We live in a society. That is true. If you lived in a completely different society, you might not have this condition. It might be considered normal. It might be considered healthy. But the one we live in,
Oh, I see. You're saying the medicalization,
that's the
but
medicalization of it. Yeah,
but the phenomenon would still exist.
it would.
Whereas it
Yeah,
sounds like you're saying if there was no society, the phenomenon of gender dysphoria would not exist.
if gender did not exist in society, uh, I don't know. I would say probably not, or at least definitely not to the extent because you wouldn't have that relationship to gender that would cause you to feel like you are something that you're not perceived as, or a conflict between like what you perceive yourself as and what you feel inside. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, it does. This is an important point to me because like it changes the way that I reason about this if this is like a phenomenon that is independent of society. Something like if it's something like being bipolar or being schizophrenic, where it's like this is an aspect of your personality or like some makeup of your brain that has nothing to do with the people around you, that changes the way I think about it. But for me, if it's something that wouldn't exist if there was no society, then it just sounds kind of like a mind virus.
So something that helps a lot, and this is a true and correct view of genealogy and biology, is that there is no neat separation there. You wouldn't have it. Like there would be no sexuality without a society, without a concept of other people. Like if you existed by yourself in a vacuum, you would not have a sexuality. You wouldn't have you wouldn't have a language. You wouldn't have a
But you
sexuality.
you would still have a sex drive though, right?
You would have a sex. Well, you would have physical manifestations in your body, but since they're so far removed from the concept of having sex, I don't know if you would call that a sex drive. You would call that an erection, or you would call that yeah, that's all
Right.
you would call it.
Okay, well, I think I disagree here because like the idea of uh the idea of like heterosexuality has like evolutionary underpinnings, and I'm pretty sure that most organisms have like some neurons that are telling them or indicating to them that this is the female and like that mating is important. So I feel like even outside of society, a person would probably still have some of that underlying structure. It's just that it wouldn't be getting used.
That's where the that's where the interwoven of like society and contact with other people. That's why you can't separate it from quote unquote biology. These two things are so intermingled and intertwined that you cannot pull them away from each other. You can't neatly say this thing is innate, and you can't neatly say this thing's only a social construct, because the two things are the Venn diagram is a circle.
Mm.
Like any sort of psychiatric illness is necessarily, what did it originate in their brain, or did it originate in like their reactions to society, like trauma, like PTSD? Would that exist innately in the brain without society? It's
Uh,
hard to say, right?
no, yeah, no, it wouldn't.
Yes. With bipolar disorder, would that exist? Would
I
ADHD exist?
I don't think ADHD would exist without society, but I think bipolar disorder probably would.
Maybe. It depends on
Like
like.
like people have let's take the example of like people that have seizures. There's a direct cause of that.
Yeah, that's not a
It's like
psychiatric disorder. That's a neurological disorder.
no, okay, different. Uh, what's a different example? Well, I mean, I did. Do you consider schizophrenia to be psychological or neurological?
Psychological.
Psychological. Okay, so I'm gonna stick with the schizophrenia example. Like I actually know a person who like he hears voices sometimes, and he'll be like, "Did you hear that?" And I'll be like, "No, dude, I didn't
So
hear that." And
this is a really good example actually, because would you be hearing voices if you didn't know what voices were? Could they be sending you messages if you didn't have a conception of language? Could you have different personalities if you didn't have a concept of what personality was? So you see, there might be something underlying there, but the way it manifests itself, our conceptions of how these things manifest themselves in people are, by necessity, they're colored by our interactions with society. There might be something underlying there, but if you take that person out of society, you somehow raise them in a hunter-gatherer society, maybe it's different. Maybe it manifests itself completely differently, or maybe it doesn't manifest itself in a way that would be different from the people around them at all.
yeah, I mean that's a pretty big maybe. Like I'm
It's a big,
like
it is a big
we can't
maybe.
answer we can't answer this definitively because this is a pretty out there hypothetical. But I tend to think that things like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder would still manifest, even if they don't manifest the same way. They would still manifest because there's an underlying origin to the condition.
Yeah, and if they did manifest, what happened if what if it did manifest itself, but it wasn't seen as a negative? It didn't cause them problems in their tribe, in their environment. It didn't cause them any significant problems in terms of survival.
Right. If it didn't, yeah, if it didn't cause them, like, it doesn't necessarily have to be seen as a negative, but
In
we can still identify that this is a condition that is not something that most people
well,
experience,
that's where
or it's a unique condition.
well,
Yeah.
that's where the medicalization comes in. Like personality quirks might not be medicalized if they don't cause you harm in society. It's always
Right.
contextual. Like the biggest thing of how psychiatric illnesses are come up with and diagnosed, it has to be relational to society, and it has to be relational to like what your needs are within that society. Like if you can't feed yourself, that is a huge problem. But how you feed yourself is you have to interact with society. So it's completely interwoven, and that's why, since we cannot say for certain like how, if there's something deep within the brain, a switch that's been turned, and it will be like this no matter what the society was, because we physically cannot know that. We can only see how someone's brain is manifesting itself in their current social environment. Because of that, self ID is actually our best guess. Can someone lie? Absolutely. But it's our best guess at getting at the actual truth, because someone's going to know their brain better than anyone else.
Hmm. Oh no, I don't agree with that at all. I don't think that people have like objective knowledge of their own mental processes. I think that
I'm
most
saying,
of what's going on in our brain is like completely,
oh, true,
yeah, we're
but
yeah.
you have the best knowledge of what's going on inside your brain. You have the
Mm,
best. You don't. You might. It might not be. Well, it's going to be. Well, it can't be objective because like it's still from your perspective, but you're going to have the best because you have access to everything versus someone, an outside observer, trying to look in, trying to infer what you think based on what you say, or trying to infer based on your behaviors. They're still going to be like have a massive disadvantage based on like what you're experiencing. Even if you're experiencing something that is completely not grounded in reality, your concession of that experience is still the best. Like you still know what's going on in your head better than anyone else.
I would say you know what you're experiencing, but you don't know what's going on in your head.
That's yeah, distinction without a difference there. But oh, no, no,
Well,
no, 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 never mind. I see
yeah,
it. I see it. Yeah.
yeah, because because like sometimes we think that we have the solution to our own problems, but we're just wrong, or sometimes we have a neurological problem and we don't want to admit it.
Yeah, and that's where the medical field comes in. That's why psychiatry is a thing. That's why therapy is a thing. But in terms of like someone's self identity, it's still the best option that we have. It's still the most reliable option that we have. And there's enough proof to say that this is a real thing. This is what causes someone the most concordance in their identity and how they're viewed in society. Causes the most concordance if we accept them based on the identity that they tell us. It doesn't seem to cause harms in any significant fashion whatsoever. So all the evidence points to this is going to cause the most harm reduction and the largest increase in happiness in society if we allow these trans affirmative policies.
Well, in terms of the harm that's done, I think that we're a little bit still in the beginning stages of this social change that, you know, we may be jumping the gun and saying that there's no harm done. Like I personally, I think that there's the potential for a major misunderstanding of like lots of objective realities
Like what?
that can come about if we don't like steer this back in the direction towards like basing it in something. Like it's not going to be one specific thing, but it's like we change the definition of sex, then we change the definition of gender, then we change the definition of female, and
Well,
it's like
we've always separated like sex and gender, or at least
I'm not sure that that's true.
or at least like we've been separating them, and we've gotten a lot more utility out of them in the past couple of decades by separating the two things. Like the definition of sex is still always contextual. Like in reproductive biology, sex means what it does because it gives us the most utility in that field.
Hmm.
The definition of sex is what it is in my field of exercise science because that gives us the most utility.
Right. So, and you can tell me if you disagree with this, but in the way that I was educated, and I would argue that the way most people were educated, sex and gender were literally synonyms. Like they meant the exact same thing.
They meant they were mostly synonyms growing up, but uh, now I think that most people have a conception of that they are different things, and that's what's being taught now because it's a better understanding of those two things. After all, like why would you have these two different words if they mean the exact same thing? Like
Oh, we have a lot of words that mean the same thing.
well, a lot
We
of
have a lot of,
words.
that's
Oh,
why we have
well,
synonyms.
a synonym doesn't mean the exact same thing. Otherwise, why would you need to use other words? We already have the word for it. But they can have
Sometimes
different flavors
people,
on similar
yeah.
things.
Uh, uh, there's not a specific need for words to mean the same thing, but we still do have words that mean the same thing.
Yeah,
And
but usually it's a there's a different
mm,
flavor with all
yeah.
synonyms. They usually mean have a different connotation to them.
Mm-hmm.
And it's with sex and gender. I think it's we get a lot of utility separating the two terms out.
Okay. I'm almost out of time, so I wanted to do this one last question because it's
Sure.
something that's really important to my conception of this. So, in my personal theory, is that when we talk about gender identity, we're talking about something that either is exactly the same as personality or it is like so closely aligned that we can't really tell the difference, right? Because you could say that personality is non-binary, right? That makes sense. It's pretty easy. You could say that. You could say that.
It'd say personality is multifaceted because, like, to say non-binary is still like referring to a binary scale. I know what you're saying though.
Right, right. Well, you could say that personality is a spectrum.
Yeah, a
And you
three-dimensional
could,
spectrum.
yeah, and you could say that it like changes over time. It's a little bit fluid,
Now, even then,
and
it's
that
kind of
it's
hard to say
unique
personality
to
is a
yeah.
spectrum, like because like a spectrum between what two things, or between like what it's multifaceted.
Well, no, a spectrum is inherently not between two things. Like I think you're thinking of like a bimodal distribution.
It's still like the color spectrum is what's on in my
Yeah, I'm,
head.
I'm thinking of the color spectrum.
Yeah, but eventually you'll loop back around. And so with personality, there's so many different traits with so many different
Right, right.
interpretations. Yeah, again, it's incidental to your point though.
Yeah, so I have trouble like when I think of a person saying like I'm non-binary, what I imagine is this person has a personality that is not stereotypically male or stereotypically female. And like when I think about it that way, then everybody's non-binary because almost nobody fits the male and female stereotypes. Like those stereotypes are like based on magazines and movies. So like
So the trans people would say, and I would say this as well, that there's a difference between gender identity and gender expression. That's why, like, they'll say, like, yeah, you can absolutely have masculine women, you can absolutely have feminine men, you can absolutely have androgynous people. All that stuff is fine. That's separate from gender identity. In my mind, the difference between a personality trait and a an identity, just talking about the words identity, is a matter of scale. They're kind of related, and it's hard to point off a hard cutoff point. But there is a meaningful difference between like something that is a personality trait versus something that's an identity. Because an identity is a category. A category like this is where what you would describe yourself as in terms of like your most basic characteristics versus a personality trait is something that's is not super intrinsic to you. It can manifest itself in way different places. Like, what's an example of a personality trait?
uh uh I like to refer to the big five. Uh so like agreeableness,
Okay,
disagreeableness,
let's use agreeableness. So
yeah,
agreeableness doesn't manifest itself all the time. If I'm sitting by my room, uh, if I'm sitting in my room listening to music, I'm not really agreeable or disagreeable because it doesn't make
right.
sense to describe myself like that. But I am a man. I am gay. Those two things are
Hmm.
still true. But agreeable or disagreeable, like that doesn't make as much sense. I wouldn't say like, well, right now, like, there's no situation where that would be true. But something like I'm a man, I'm gay, I'm white, all these things would be identities because they're true no matter what the situation is.
Right. So I guess where I get lost is if your identity is not based in characteristics that you have, which I'm calling personality traits, then what is it that makes you feel like a man or a woman? Because like the we could define masculinity based on average personality traits. We could do that,
Hmm.
but I don't think we really do that. But like if we didn't define it that way, how exactly would we define it?
Well, how do you define masculinity? We have a conception of masculinity in your head, and
Hmm.
I don't think that like it's hard to have a concrete definition of masculinity, right? It's almost in it's this is like have you ever read Derrida?
I haven't read any Derrida actually. No.
Let me a better question. Have you ever attempted to read Derrida and then gotten really mad and really drunk? Did
No,
you-
they made us read a lot of books, but they did not make us read any like Foucault or Derrida or
well,
any of like the social
well,
constructionists for
read
some
some
reason.
Derrida and you'll find out what a sentence looks like if there are 19 semicolons in the sentence. Anyway, there's a concept that
Jesus Christ.
I know there's a concept that I still really liked. Différence. It's like words are only words based on their relationship and differentiation between other words. And so like to have this conception of masculinity, it's like, well, masculinity is different than femininity, and that's kind of where you have to start. There's something in masculine that is different than something in feminine, and we can, based on differentiation, we have these two concepts, and so they're identities where we can the way we interact with the world, they're deep seated in how am I different than other people. It's why like big normative identities don't have that same sort of salience as minority identities. So that's where that comes from. It's you're always this thing uh, differentiated between within your view of society versus a personality trait. It is a lot more contextual. Like you can be agreeable, like have the big five trait of agreeable, but you might still get in a fucking fight with this fucking asshole at this goddamn bar who's like just pissing you off. But you can still be agreeable in most circumstances.
Right,
But
but where the agreeableness would come in there is whether or not you invite the fight or you try to avoid it. Like a more agreeable person would try to like talk their way out of it, but a less agreeable person would be like, "Bring it on."
yeah, but and even then though, it's going to be contextual. Like if you get in one fight because you're just having a really really bad day, and you invite the fight because you're just pissed off, that's a temporary change in your personality traits. But you're not temporarily changing. You're not changing your gender. You're still a dude. You're still you still what's another identity? You're still a Kentuckian if you live in Kentucky. You're still a Kentuckian if you identify with that label. And it's not just geographic. Like I'm a Kentuckian if I go to Texas. That's still a deep seated identity that doesn't change. It's I would almost say that like identities are less based in personality because they don't change as much. They're more deep seated. There's definitely a continuum. There's definitely a spectrum between identity and personality, but it has to, I know this is an unsatisfactory answer, but you know it when you see it. Identities are more deep seated than personality traits.
Right. That's generally speaking the answer that I get, and it is unsatisfactory. But I to be honest, I consider it to be a very hard question, and like I'm not gonna push my perspective on you, but my perspective is I think that the people who identify a certain way, I think that our conceptions of masculinity and femininity are generally rooted in average behavioral differences that we see between men and women, and those do show up a little bit in Big Five research. Like Big Five research pretty confidently shows that like men are
On
on
average,
average
different, yeah.
more, yeah, and women are on average more like neurotic and agreeable and that type of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that the nebulous conception that we have of gender is rooted in some of these behavioral and personality traits that we as a society have observed.
Yeah,
So
there's something.
yes.
There's definitely something to that, but it also like all of these agreeable traits are like they're manifesting themselves in the way we look, interact with society, to the point where because we do have a conception of gender in society, that's where the like gender abolition argument comes in. Because we do have a conception of this, a lot of people just feel a lot more comfortable identifying with like a lot. They feel a lot more comfortable, and they have a better self actualization, better self identity, identifying as a sex that they were not assigned at birth, and that's it works out better for them.
Okay. Okay. Well, I'm running out of time. This has been a good talk. Like I actually enjoyed this talk. Is
Yeah,
there
that's fun.
anything you want to say before we depart?
Nah, it was a very agreeable talk.
Yeah, yeah. I prefer actual discussions than shouting matches. I much prefer that. Like my motivation is to get to the bottom of this, not to win internet points. Well, that's what Twitter's for, is win internet points. But if I can sit down and talk to somebody and like we actually bounce ideas off each other, that's much preferable than shouting constantly.
Okay, cool, yeah, dude.
But
All
yeah,
right, have a good
yeah.
rest of your day.
Nice talk. You too, man.
Peace out.